I have here a letter that was written to me by you, the third graders of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Elementary School. I'm very happy to be able to answer these questions, and I'm hoping that you'll learn something about me you didn't know before. The first question is, where were you born? I was born in Johnstown, New York. That's in the Hudson River Valley. I grew up in a fine big house full of beautiful furniture and attended by a household of servants. Some of those servants were hired just to look after my sisters and me. And they had their work cut out for them because we were often getting into mischief. What were your parents like? Well, my mother was tall and an expert horsewoman. She was the daughter of a Revolutionary War hero, James Livingston. She had a very military mind when it came to raising children and was very strict. Although when she was older, she became much more jolly and made a much more fun grandmother than she had been a mother. Eventually, she became a suffragist. My father was a quiet man, very principled, modest, and deeply intelligent. I think in a sense we were all a little afraid of him because he was so quiet and stern. He also had a broken heart because his sons had all died as children, except for my brother Eliezer, who unfortunately passed away when he was a young man. I very much wanted to make my father proud of me because I was so proud of him, and I felt terrible that his heart was broken over the loss of my brothers. And I told him that I wished to be as good as a son to him. What was it like for you as a kid? What were your favorite things to do? I loved dancing and playing outside. I loved to play in the creek that ran close to our house and to climb up and down a large pile of wood that was outside of our house that we called the Alps. When it was covered in snow, it was the most fun, and we would play climbing and sliding in the snow all afternoon if they would let us, but eventually someone always came and told us we had to come inside. We loved to play in the attic and the creek and the cellar, most of all, I think, and probably because all three of those places were forbidden. Were there any games or board games back then that we still play today? Well, it so happens that I am very good at chess, and I enjoy playing it immensely. Now, if you ever were to play chess with me, you'd have to become very good because I play to win, and I would never give you an easy time. My children often complained that there was no way to win against me unless you played very, very hard. Were there any special holiday treats that we had at Christmas time? You mentioned in particular peanut butter balls dipped in chocolate, which sounds delicious, but we never had anything like that. What we had instead were a kind of Dutch cake, fried in oil and stuffed with raisins, called an oliekoek. And we would find an oliekoek in our stockings on Christmas morning every year. In addition, there were little papers filled with candy, nuts, and raisins. And most wonderfully, in the toe of our stockings, we could find a bright, shiny $quarter. Let's see. Oh, these questions are about my life as an adult. How many times did you move in your lifetime? Well, I'm not really sure exactly. I think it was around 10 times. But the problem is that although I lived in only a few houses that I owned, I was so often traveling and staying in other places for months or even more than a year at a time that it's difficult to say where home was. I was born in Johnstown. I went to boarding school in Troy, New York at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary. In 1840, after I married my husband, I lived in London and traveled in Scotland, Ireland, and France for a year. And then my husband and I moved back in with my parents in Johnstown and in Albany. I lived in Boston and Chelsea, and then we moved to Seneca Falls. And after Seneca Falls, at the beginning of the Civil War, we moved to New York City. We lived in Brooklyn, and then we moved again and again in New York City until finally in 1868 I bought a big beautiful house in Tenafly, New Jersey. But I traveled all over. I traveled in Europe. I traveled out west to California. I lived for a winter in Omaha, Nebraska with one of my daughters, and I lived in England with another daughter, and was often on the road sharing messages about equality and freedom with other Americans. So in some ways, all of the United States was my home. You ask, were there secret places in the Stanton home? And you want to know who built it. Well, the house was built by brothers, the Bayard brothers. They were land speculators, which meant that they bought land in the hopes that they could sell it off for a profit. They had some bad fortune, and my father became the owner of the house, and he in turn gave it to me. Now, I continued to build on the house so that it grew bigger and bigger and bigger along with my family. Eventually I had 7 children and I needed a place to put them all. There was a joke between my husband and me that every time he went away on a business trip, I would put in a new door or window. And he used to laugh and say that his gravestone would say, Henry B. Stanton died of fresh air, because the house was always full of wide open windows. You want to know my kids' names. My children were Daniel, Henry, Garrett. Then I had Theodore, Margaret, Harriet, and Robert. I didn't call them that. They were Neil, Kit, and Gat, Theo, and then I had Maggie, Hattie, and Bob. Did you have to walk everywhere? No, indeed, we didn't have to walk everywhere. In fact, I lived in a very interesting place when it comes to transportation. I lived right near the Seneca Turnpike. Now, that's a toll road, which means you had to pay a fare to use it. And it ran from Albany to Buffalo. And what was really interesting about living in the place where I lived in Seneca Falls was that twice a week, a stagecoach carrying the mail would come through. And when it got to about my house, the stagecoach would stop and a man would take out a horn and he would blow the horn, one long note, to alert the village that the mail was coming into town. We also lived close to the Cayuga and Seneca Canal, and that was in turn connected to the Erie Canal. Now, what was really interesting about that was that people would travel on the Erie Canal in packet boats with these wonderful names. Names like the Heron or the Redbird. And in order to attract people to buy passage on these packet boats, they would decorate them with beautiful flags, and sometimes they would even have brass bands playing on board. In addition to that, we often used the train. So when Mrs. Mott came to New York State to visit her sister, Martha Coffin Wright, who lived in Auburn, she and Martha would come and visit me using the train. Or I would visit Martha frequently to consult with her about issues of women's rights. So the trains were very convenient and very fast, although perhaps not as fast as they are in your time. You want to know, if women couldn't keep the money they earned, how did they buy the stuff they needed? Well, the short answer is that they had to ask their husbands. And I always thought that was very unfair, that a grown woman should have to ask permission to use her own money.